Welcome to Garden Plants with Jim Putnam. Let's talk about Cestrum parqui. So this is Cestrum parqui, which is a really interesting, incredibly long-bloomed shrub that we have in our Raleigh garden here. It has a Royal Horticultural Merit Award, and there's a good reason for that. It's again one of the longest blooming plants we have in our garden. Hummingbirds love it. Pollinators absolutely love it. It's kind of it's really almost herbaceous in our area. It will actually die back to the ground, but in other areas it will bloom. It will stay woody and bloom almost year-round in warmer areas. It's a South American native, and it's moved through South America and in other areas. It's not really invasive for us because our winters control it, but in Australia and other areas it can be an invasive plant. And the birds absolutely love these little black berries on them, and they're the thing that actually spread it around. This plant tends to have very wispy branches on it, but it can reach 15 feet in height. For us here in Raleigh, generally, it's a dieback plant. So most of it will die back to the ground, and then it comes back up with about 15 suckers every spring, and then we cut it down to about 6 or 7 that we select. And then it stands up big and tall on its own to about 6 or 7 feet. And it does that pretty much every winter. The last couple of winters, we have just not gotten cold enough to kill it back to the ground, and I've actually just cut it to the ground because I think it's resetting. It ends up with more flowers. It doesn't lean over as badly. Like if I let this thing get 10 or 12 feet tall with our rains and wind and that kind of thing, it'd be leaning over at this point. So, but somewhere between 5 and 15 feet. If you cut it back though in the late winter, 5 to 7 feet is what you'd expect in a single season. They're hardy in zones 7 to 10. I think really 7B to 10. We're in 8A here in Raleigh. Definitely in zone 7B, the thing's going to die back to the ground every winter. And you'd want to spring plant it to make sure it has a season under it before it goes into its first winter. Again, like in zone 10, it's not ever going to die back to the ground, and it's just going to get bigger and taller over time. And I think even there, you'd want to cut it back to the ground at some point and just allow it to reset. In my area here in Raleigh, because I'm cutting it back to the ground and allowing it to come back, it's probably June before it actually comes into flower. It would definitely be earlier if you weren't cutting it back. And it stays in flower until we get a frost or a freeze in the fall. And it has these yellow, orangey flowers on it. They're tubular shaped. And so, when you have these deep tubular shaped flowers like this, you're definitely going to see butterflies and hummingbirds are the likely pollinators, but it has some evening fragrance to it, so I'm guessing moths are probably its primary, the primary thing it's after, because the flowers don't have a lot of fragrance during the day, and then in the evening they do, they are fragrant. They eventually mature into these black fruit that the birds again love and take, and luckily for us, there's not the seed is not germinating all over the place. It seems like winter must be some sort of control for it. The foliage is interesting, and the smell of the flowers is interesting. I think some people would say this foliage smells like peanut butter. Some people say rubber. It's either something you would just go, oh, that smells awful, or you would just be like amazed by how much it smells like peanut butter if that was the thing you liked about it. I mean, it's interesting. You're going to have a reaction. Trust me, you're going to smell this foliage and have a reaction. I don't know if it's going to be good or bad. It is toxic to horses and cattle, that kind of thing. And all parts of this plant are poisonous. It has such an off fragrance that I don't think anything is probably, other than like goats, which will just kind of eat anything, which is not a good idea. I think most things are going to know that this is definitely not on the list of things that they should be eating. So you can see in the second full season in the ground here in Raleigh, it reached 7 feet. I cut it literally to the ground, had about 15 to 20 new pieces coming up out of the ground. We cut it down to about 7, and then I actually held them together down here inside of it with the strap. And so it's held together so that it stands up big and tall, because these are very wispy branches, and they'll flower and then branch and then flower and then branch and flower and then branch, and you end up with so much weight on the top that it does get floppy in the garden if it's not allowed to. If you don't stake it up in some way. Looks really good in our kind of cottage garden, front garden here, where it stands up big and tall. A lot of times these little narrow things with a little bit of branching like this look really good when you have lower perennials and lower flowering things in the garden. And again, if it's held together like this, it's very well behaved out here. Perfect pollinator plant, pollinator garden type of plant, because it just never stops flowering. And we love seeing the hummingbirds up here, because they're up here big and tall on the top of it. And I saw a bumblebee was overnighting on it before we started shooting, and I don't know if we've oh, it's right up here. It's actually a bumblebee overnighting on it. They must be in here cheating, going into the back of the flowers and drilling into them as well. But just, again, I think it's the perfect kind of location for it. Keep in mind, it's going to get some height on it. You can keep it, it will stay a little narrower. So any place that you've got a lot of sun, you know, to get it, I think if you put this in too much shade, it's really going to get tall and wispy, and then it's going to be, because it has a flopping kind of nature, if it's in the shade, it's going to reach too much and flop over. So I think it needs a good amount of sun, but we in this garden have everything planted a little close together, and so the roots on it are shaded while the top is in almost all day sun. I have heard in Australia this plant is problematic for cattle, so I guess the cattle will eat it despite the fragrance of it, and it is, you know, again, it is toxic. When we have something that's hardy in zone 7 to 10 or 5 to 9, or this, you know, wide range of zones, a lot of times by the time you get to that hottest zone, like 10 on this, it probably would benefit from a little bit of afternoon shade. So keep that in mind. Anything we're putting on this garden plants thing, if it has a really wide range, typically in its northern range, it can go in full day sun, and then in its southern range, it may need a little bit of afternoon shade. Basically no maintenance on this plant except for twice a year. We'll cut it, you know, once the freeze really knocks it back, we could go ahead and cut it to the ground at that point probably, but we generally wait until March and we cut the thing to the ground, and then sometime around mid-April it will be in the process of branching back up. By the 1st of May, we'll make a decision on which of those new pieces coming out of the ground are the most vigorous. And we'll keep about 7 of them and cut the rest of them to the ground. And then we tied it together, and that was it. And it has not stopped blooming. We had an open garden event here in June, and it was already in full bloom at that point, and it has never stopped. And we had not had to do any pruning on it. If you get a crazy branch on it during the season, we'll cut that off, but other than that, and if it's eating anything else. And then you can come in here if you want to and deadhead it. So if you were concerned about the berries on it or the fruit on it being a problem, you can just, you know, cut these flower stems back as they fade before that actually forms. And that any pruning you do on it, it's going to branch, and then you're going to get additional flowers. See how it blooms on the terminal end of this. So if I cut it back to here where the side branch is, I'm immediately going to get I'm going to get additional branching on that side. So deadheading if you wanted to. We fertilize everything in this garden once a year in the spring with an organic fertilizer, and we keep the ground mulched, and that's it. And it's super vigorous. The foliage is dark green. Really very low maintenance plant, except when it needs maintenance. And then it needs a lot of maintenance. It needs to be cut back. It needs to be, you know, but it's quick. It's like, I would say we probably did 30 minutes of maintenance on this thing, but talking to a video camera makes it longer. Because of the fragrance of the foliage, the deer definitely don't mess with this plant. It's incredibly humidity tolerant. I just have never seen any pest around it whatsoever, so, you know, just don't have to think about that. We had a neighbor just give us a small piece of his plant to plant over here. It can be propagated during the growing season and create additional plants. You can take a branch down at the bottom and lay it on the ground, cover it in mulch, and make a separate plant as well. But we had a nice neighbor give us a small piece of this plant, and it's just been rewarded us ever since. But really like this plant overall, and I think, you know, in cooler areas where it's being controlled and not invasive like this, it's really a fantastic plant to get pollinators into the garden, even during the peak of the summer when maybe some of the other things might slow down just a bit. That's when this thing really, really thrives in the heat. I would call it marginally drought tolerant once established, and it likes kind of moist, well-drained soil, and I could say that in literally every video. Every plant wants a little, just enough water to keep it happy. It just wouldn't want to sit. It wouldn't want to sit in water. But we went 6 weeks of drought here earlier in the season, and this thing being in its second season really didn't need any of that additional water. Other things in the garden definitely did, but this one would have been fine without it after it's been established in the ground for a couple of seasons. So there you go. This is Cestrum parqui. I highly recommend it for, again, bringing pollinators into the garden, having something flowering all season. It's got some vertical height on it, which is kind of hard to come by. Most of our really great flowering things that flower all summer, you know, stay in this kind of 18-inch to 3-foot range. And this one sits up big and tall above all of it. Thanks for watching.